Hello and welcome to vlog number 5, I think it is. As I posted on my blog and various things like Facebook and Twitter, I've been collecting some questions from you out there, and in this vlog I intend to answer them as best I can. So without further ado, the first question comes from Annalise in Adelaide. Annalise. She says, or asks, what were your early influences? I have to be honest, I suppose a huge early influence was the Fighting Fantasy series, Steve Jackson and Ian Livingstone. The first book came out in '82 when I was 11 years old, and it was just fantastic. I never read anything like it before, and then tried to emulate that for years and years and years until obviously when I got my first commission it was a Fighting Fantasy game book. But on top of them, I mean, I'd say Terry Pratchett, although it's not obvious through the books I've chosen to write. He's still a big influence today, partly I think because I remember him in an interview saying once that how much fun writing was, and it really brought it home that this, which was something I did find enjoyable and was a hobby, could actually become a living. Also Ellis Peters. In my teen years I read a lot of Brother Cadfael mysteries, and I remember reading somewhere, I think, that Ellis Peters, or rather Edith Pargeter, as her real name is, or was, had her first book published at 22, and that was something I aspired to, and actually got my first commission age 20, so I managed that one. Right, question 2. Stuart Lloyd of Lloyd's Gamebooks, I think. So hi Stuart. He asks, where do you see the gamebook genre going in terms of setting? Fantasy, sci-fi, modern, etc. And in terms of medium, paper, apps, PDF. I think in terms of where it's going to progress the most, it's through apps. Just as there's ebooks are becoming more and more popular, there's the element of it keeps costs down in terms of production. But I think with things like Tin Man Games, Gamebook Adventures, you can do things with an app which you can't do the book. So I mean, for example, with those you shake your iPod or your iDevice and it rolls the dice for you. They've also introduced elements of a computer game with achievements, and you can have a gallery and go look at the pictures you've seen. So I think probably that way. In terms of subject matter, I think potentially anything. It's always been very tied up with fantasy mainly. I suppose that's because it grew out of games like Dungeons and Dragons, and it's the ultimate escapism. A friend and I actually had an idea for a game book based on a stag do, but it never came to anything at the time. Sci-fi, I think yes. I mean, I've written fantasy adventures, but I've got ideas for all sorts of things. I mean, I've written Doctor Who and Star Wars, which is science fiction, or fantasy, you could argue. But you know, steampunk, obviously. I've got ideas for sort of apocalyptic western, sort of near-future sci-fi, superheroes, all sorts of things. And if I get the opportunity, I'd love to develop those. Urban fantasy, urban horror. Sorry, Stuart goes on to say, what do you think makes game books popular today? Now, do you mean game books, as in physical books, or do you mean the apps? I suppose there's always the element of choice. I know when I first picked them up, the fact that you dictated what happened in the story was hugely appealing, and I guess that's still true today. I mean, people play computer games in which you're the protagonist, so it's the same aspect. It's getting to live out another life. Again, the whole escapism thing. But in terms of actual books, there's less of a market for them today. But if you're like me, I mean, I love books. Part of the satisfaction in writing a book for me is at the end of the day, there's something I can actually, a physical object I can hold. And the smell of a new book, the sound it makes when you open it, the feel of the pages. I mean, that's where the app, rather like computer games, I remember Dara O'Brien doing in one of his sketches saying that computer games are the only medium where you're punished for not being good enough at it. In that once you can't get past a certain level, you don't know what happens in the rest of the game. You don't have a book which shuts itself halfway through saying you do not understand the themes of this book, so do not continue reading. So obviously with the app you can't see all the pictures if you don't find them yourself, whereas with a Fighting Fantasy book, I mean, one of the first things I did was flick through and look at all the pictures. Particularly of some artists, because they're just fantastic pieces of work outside of the book itself. Next question is from Rob Sanders. Hi Rob. In case you don't know, Rob's another Black Library author. He's doing great things actually. I think he might be starting to write for the Horus Heresy. Don't know that for sure, but he's doing very well. So check out his blog, by the way. Rob, I think it's rob-sanders.blogspot.com. Anyway, he asks, "Hi John, I'm impressed that you juggle both fiction and non-fiction. Being a teacher, non-fiction has always held a prospect of interest from a writing point of view. Is that how you got into it?" Strangely, I got my first non-fiction gig. Oh no, actually no. The first one was when I was a teacher, because it's when I wrote the Go-Go's book, which has actually been reprinted in another updated edition. Go-Go's a Go-Go it was called at the time. That was '96, but in turn that was a bit of it's shorter than some of my short stories. So I guess my first proper non-fiction book I consider is Match Wits with the Kids, which is an educational book, and ironically was written after I gave up teaching full time. And it was a case of I knew the publisher. It was Icon, who their Wizard imprint have printed the Fighting Fantasy material, and so my new books. They knew I was a teacher, and they knew that I'd gone part-time to develop the writing, and they approached me saying, "Is this something you'd be interesting to pitch for?" And what we came up with between us was Match Wits with the Kids. And Rob goes on to say, "What are the differences in respect to managing a project? Okay, is it right that non-fiction titles are approved at a proposal stage as opposed to fiction titles generally requiring completion before consultation with publishers?" I know that a lot of publishers now will only look at a finished manuscript, or at least they want to look at part of what they know is a finished manuscript. For example, Angry Robot Books, this month is their unsolicited submissions month. So if you don't have an agent, you've not been published, but you've written a whole novel and it fulfills their criteria, do check their submission pages very carefully so you don't get rejected at the first stage. But they're actually looking at some which is unusual. But again, I know that they want it to have been a completed novel and you just send in the first few chapters and a synopsis. But like I say, check their submission pages, don't take it from me. For me, because of my track record and people I work for, I send a synopsis for the novel, and that's what gets me the commission. But then also, my editors know that I don't vary that much from the synopsis. I know writers who change things hugely. Mine's a very detailed chapter breakdown, and a few things might get altered. Chapter breaks might shift around. Sometimes I add a few chapters to stretch something out. But it doesn't really change much from what they're told they're going to get. With the non-fiction, again, I've submitted it as a proposal which has a breakdown of chapters and the content of those chapters. But again, I've been working with people I have a history with. In terms of managing the project, I always write these ridiculous timetables for myself when I write a novel of how long it's going to take me, and it always takes much longer, so I'm possibly a bit foolish, but to try and get some handle on the time management of it. With the non-fiction stuff, generally it's shorter in terms of the finished book, but it takes just as long to write because of the research. When you're making it up, you make it up. And there's some things I do research my Pax Britannia books. There's things from the real world which I try and get right, or I check for reference. So in terms of managing it, ones I've written have had quite short chapters, or I might say this week I'm writing the chapter on geography, for example, with Match Wits with the Kids. Other ones are Christmas books. I'll have like a couple of sections which I want to try and tackle that day. But because of the nature of the research, I always find I go back and add things to previous chapters. So it's never completely finished until I send off the manuscript, and even then the editor might have some suggestions as well. So does that help, Rob? Probably not, sorry. Question from Sarah Snat, who I once did teaching practice with, so hi Sarah. Custard or ice cream? It would have to be custard.